So, you finally set up server-side Google Tag Manager, but instead of seeing better data accuracy, your attribution has not improved at all. That is because server-side GTM requires a proper setup and attention to detail. Today, I'm going to show you 10 most common server-side Google Tag Manager mistakes and how to fix them. So the first mistake is to using server provider's default URL instead of using your own custom domain. What I mean by that is that if you host a Google Tag Manager server container, then that container gets a unique URL. If you're doing that on Google Cloud Run, then a sample URL might look something like this. If you're using a specialized server-side Google Tag Manager hosting provider like Stape, then a default URL might look like this. So if you keep using the default URL, you will be missing various server-side Google Tag Manager benefits. For example, you would not be able to extend the cookie lifetime if you keep using this domain. Also, it is considered a third-party domain. If your website is hosted on a particular domain, for example, here I have a gtmplayground.com, then your server-side setup should also be using the same domain, not the default ones that you get from hosting providers. The next mistake is not updating your website tags so that they send data not directly to Google, for example, but they send data to your server-side container. A very popular setup looks like this. You have a website container, then here you have some tags, and you also have a server-side Google Tag Manager container. So by utilizing this kind of setup, you should update your website container tags so that they send data not directly to Google, but to your server-side container. Just keep in mind that not all tags support this feature, but those that do should be updated to use a particular parameter. The parameters and their locations will differ depending on the vendor. For example, here is a snippet of a Google Analytics event tag, and here you should use the server container URL parameter, where you insert the URL of your server-side container. But if you are using a different tag template, for example, Stape's data tag, then they have a dedicated field where you need to enter the server-side container's URL. If both of these tags are in the same container, then the values here should also be the same. And what's important here is that you should apply this setting to all tags that have this option, and you want them to send data to your server-side container. Because if you don't update, for example, all Google Analytics tags, and some of them fire a bit early, then they might be sending data directly to Google, which will mess up your attribution, and you might see more not set values in your traffic acquisition reports. By the way, I release Google Analytics or Google Tag Manager tutorials every week. If you want consistent flow of fresh knowledge and to stay up to date, then subscribe to this channel. It will help us a lot. The next mistake is not having a proper setup to extend the cookie lifetime, because one of the benefits of server-side Google Tag Manager is that you can extend the lifetime of cookies. ITP, or also known as Apple's Intelligent Tracking Prevention, is a solution built by Apple to limit what kind of data can be tracked about the users, and also in general just limit what various ad vendors can do. One of the things that Apple is trying to limit is cookie lifetime, because cookies, as you should already know, is used a lot by ad vendors like Google or Facebook. Let's say that a visitor lands on a website. On that website, Google Analytics, Google Ads tracking codes are loaded, and naturally, they set some cookies in the visitor's browser. Now, because of ITP, these cookies will be limited to 24 hours or 7 days, which can heavily impact your attribution. If a visitor comes back to your site 8 days after he or she interacted with the ad, that conversion will not be attributed to an ad click. So what the industry did then is that they started using server-side Google Tag Manager. They hosted it on a subdomain, but it belongs to the same domain. And then they started setting cookies or extending cookies from the server-side Google Tag Manager. At first it worked, but then Apple caught up, and now even cookies set from the server are also limited to the same period. Now, how are they doing that? They check the IP address of the website, then IP address of the server-side container, and they see that they differ a lot, because usually your website is hosted on one hosting provider and your server-side container is hosted somewhere completely else, which means that their IP addresses will be different. But if Apple's Intelligent Tracking Prevention saw that the IP address of the website and of the server container are the same, then the lifetime of the cookie would be normal. One of the ways how you can do that is if you move your server-side Google Tag Manager container from a subdomain to the same origin setup. As you can see right here, the domain is the same, subdomain is the same, and then we just have a path which is specifically related to our server-side container. This is called same origin setup. Now, the steps to configure this vary a lot depending on where are you hosting your website, what kind of content delivery network are you using. But if, for example, you're using Stape, then they have a bunch of different tutorials for different vendors that you can just follow and implement. Basically, what happens here is that in front of your website server and your server-side Google Tag Manager container, there is something, let's say a load balancer or content delivery network or something that is using the same IP address. So the browser and Intelligent Tracking Prevention cannot see the real IP addresses of your server-side container and of the website. And that way it thinks that cookies are set by the website itself. Therefore, their lifetime is not limited. But of course, this is a cat and mouse game, so at any point in the future, this might change. But right now, this is working. The next mistake is not updating your website Google Tag Manager's container snippet so that it would include your own domain instead of googletagmanager.com. When you have a website Google Tag Manager container, its snippet looks like this, and it should be added to all pages of your website. But as you can see right here, we have googletagmanager.com. which means that the container itself will still be loaded from a third-party domain. Even if you have added the server container URL in your tags, this is not enough. This will be sending data to your server, but also you need to make sure that Google Tag Manager container itself is loaded via your server. So in that case, the snippet that is added to your website's code should be also updated with the same domain. So instead of using googletagmanager.com, then you should use your own domain, let's say something like this. And if you're using a specialized server-side Google Tag Manager hosting provider, then follow their instructions. For example, in Stape, they have a feature also known as a power-up, and that power-up is called Custom Loader. So here, if I click Configure, then I'm asked to enter my own domain, then my website Google Tag Manager container ID. Then you should enable this. Later, I will talk what it means. If you're using a same origin path, then you will need to enter it right here. And then you will need to choose what kind of platform are you using. Or in other words, what kind of platform is used by your website. It can be other, or it can be, let's say, WordPress, Magento. So the instructions will differ here as well. But let's say if I select other and I click generate, I will have a customized Google Tag Manager code snippet that should be used on your website. So this code should replace that code which is added already on your website. Because in this code, you will see that we have some additional changes. For example, this is my own custom domain instead of googletagmanager.com. So this is one of the necessary steps if you want to benefit from server-side Google Tag Manager. So after you implement the same origin setup, as you can see right here, I have slash and a particular path related to my server-side container, then cookies set from the server container will have normal expiration date. As an example, here is a Facebook Conversions API tag, and this tag can generate the FBP cookie. So with the same origin setup, this cookie will have proper lifetime. Now, in some cases, maybe you cannot use the same origin setup. For example, maybe you are using Shopify. Due to certain technical limitations that are present on Shopify, you can have only a subdomain. So in that case, Stape has another feature, which is called Cookie Keeper. The way how it works is that your cookies will still expire in 24 hours or 7 days, but every time the visitor reloads the page, certain cookies that you configure in Cookie Keeper, they will always be restored and recreated. So even though their lifetime is short, if you look at the browser's developer tools, they will keep living longer in the browser because they keep getting restored. The next mistake is not changing the request URL structure. Let me show you what I mean. Now let's say that you have already configured your server-side container, you have added a custom domain, you're using same origin, and now when you send a request from your website to your server container, let's say Google Analytics request, it looks like this. We have our own custom domain and then a bunch of parameters. But if you take a closer look, and if you are experienced enough, you will see that this is Google Analytics data. We have tracking ID, then we have the actual measurement ID. Now the thing here is that browser extensions can also see this. And some of them, which are more aggressive, they will block this request nevertheless, ignoring the fact that you're using a custom domain. This is happening because some of these parameters are very Google specific. For example, TID and then something that starts with G dash, it clearly indicates that this is a Google Analytics request. So if you want to reduce the impact of ad blockers or other browser extensions, you should change the request structure so that it becomes less readable. And in this case, Stabe has a feature, you're actually already familiar with it. It's called Custom Loader. But in that Custom Loader, they have a setting called Enhanced Ad Blocker Protection. If it is disabled, then your requests will look like this. You can see with the plain eye the data that was sent to your server. But if you enable this, then you can click, of course, Generate. Then you will be asked to replace the code, unless of course you select a different platform. But if you're using other, then you will need to update the tracking code on your website. And then if you wait for several moments, maybe a minute or so, then you should check the outgoing request on your website again, and its structure will be different. So now I will pause the video and I will wait for a bit and I will show you what happens next. And here it is. Now I have reloaded the page, and this is the page view request, which is very similar to what I had previously. However, all the request parameters are now hidden, which means that fewer browser extensions will be blocking this kind of request. And this means that you will collect more data in your Google Analytics or Meta ads or some other platform that you're using. By the way, did you know that I have a bunch of free ebooks on Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics? So if you want to better learn these topics, then click the link below the video, download those ebooks, and get started. Mistake number 6 is not doing data enrichment. Most of the server-side Google Tag Manager setups that I have seen look like this. They have a website Google Tag Manager container. That container sends data to their server, and then this server just forwards data further to the vendors like Google or Facebook. In this case, custom domain is used, cookie lifetime is extended, the impact of ad blockers is mitigated, but right now, these times, this is the bare minimum. Because if you just send what you get from the browser, sometimes you might find yourself in situations where your event match quality score in Facebook is still low, because your events are missing valuable user-provided data like email, first name, last name, and so on. So instead of having just this, you should also use server-side Google Tag Manager to enrich data. Here's what I mean. From the website, you send an event, let's say a lead, to your server-side Google Tag Manager container. Then, before you send that event further, first you could do requests to your CRM or maybe some third-party system, maybe your e-commerce platform, to get more information about this user. And then let's say you get email, first name, last name, all that stuff. You include that in the event, and then you send the enriched event or conversion to the vendor like Facebook or Meta. The stronger your data that you send to those vendors is, the better their AIs will be able to perform in order to find you better customers. You can also enrich data with NoSQL databases like Firestore, and also Stabe has a feature called Stabe Store. Even though it might sound complex, it is not as difficult as you might think. In a nutshell, basically, when some event, let's say form submission, happens on your website, you can temporarily store that information in Stabe Store. Let's say right here, there is a database of users. And then here, next to that particular email address, you would also have additional user data like first name, last name, and then you could use that to enrich your conversions and send stronger data to the vendors. I understand that this entire process looks like rocket science. I have to admit it's not very easy, but it's not super difficult as well. And if you want to learn the entire process of data enrichment, then take a look at my first-party data masterclass course, where I teach you how to send richer signals or conversions to the platforms that you're using. And all of that is done with server-side Google Tag Manager. And by the way, if you want to learn everything else that I mentioned in this video related to server-side Google Tag Manager, then take a look at my other course where I explain all the necessary fundamentals that you need to have before you start doing data enrichment. The next mistake is ignoring consent. Even though with server-side Google Tag Manager you get a lot of possibilities, it does not mean that you should ignore the user's privacy preferences. Server-side Google Tag Manager does not make consent obsolete. You still need to respect the consent, of course, if it applies to the regulations for your company, like, GDPR. So the process could look something like this. Let's say that a visitor lands on your website, the consent is denied. And in that case, ideally, you should not even send the request to your server-side Google Tag Manager container, which means that there will be no request sent further to the vendor. And also there will be no data enrichment happening somewhere in the middle of this process. Or let's say if your company prefers using advanced consent mode, when requests are still sent, but some data is redacted or maybe pseudo-anonymized, then keep in mind that server-side Google Tag Manager supports consent mode signals. For example, if you wanted to send user-provided data with a conversion, but consent was not given, then that request would not contain any user data. But if consent is given, then that user data would be included in the request and it would be hashed, which means that it becomes unreadable. So even though the entire consent setup is way more complex, but due to the scope of this video, I just wanted to give you like a reminder that consent is still there and you should not ignore that. But if you want to learn more about various nuances of how to configure this or that when it comes to consent, then take a look at my courses. Then the next mistake is using Google Analytics for tags, even if you don't care about Google Analytics. Most of the tutorials that you will find online that teach you how to work with server-side Google Tag Manager, they will be using Google Analytics tags in the web container. Basically, the process would look like this. You have some tag that sends data to your server container. That tag is Google Analytics tag. And then in the server container, you catch that event. For example, here I have a purchase trigger, and then it will fire a non-Google tag like Facebook Conversions API or maybe TikTok tag or Snapchat or whatever. But there are plenty of companies that are using various ad vendors, but they don't use Google Analytics. Now, if they look at those tutorials, they think that they have to use Google Analytics in the web container. Now, I have to admit, I am probably part of the problem because plenty of my tutorials are doing the same thing. But in reality, you don't have to use Google Analytics tags if you don't plan to use GA in general. Instead of using this tag, you can use another tag template, which is called data tag. So if you go to your website Google Tag Manager container, go to tags, then new tag configuration, and then here in the gallery, you look for the data tag. So just type data tag, then you add it to the container, and then you can select that tag template right here and configure the events. For example, page view, maybe you want to send purchase or something like that. Here you enter your server container URL. You can also include user data, some additional event data. So this is pretty universal. It is flexible and you can include various parameters. And then you can send data with this tag to your server container. The benefit of this compared to the Google Analytics library is because this particular tag and its library is lightweight compared to Google's library. I think Google's library is like 130 kilobytes or something like that. While here, I think this is like 10 or 20 kilobytes. So, or maybe even less, I don't remember, but it will have a much lower impact on your page performance speed. So if you think that this is useful, then investigate data tag, which should be used in the web container, and then also investigate data client, which you should add to your server container. This client will be responsible for catching requests sent by the data tag, and then it will make that data available to your server containers tags. Now, the next mistake is forgetting event duplication. In most cases, it applies to Meta Conversions API because that is one of the most popular vendors, but the same principle applies to many other vendors like Snapchat, TikTok, and so on. So if you want to send conversions to Facebook or Meta, in this case, the setup would look something like this. You have a website. From that website, a tag fires. It might be Google Analytics tag. It might be data tag. That tag sends the conversion, let's say a purchase, to your server-side container. Here, a client catches that request. Then the tag fires in your server and sends data to Facebook. But Facebook also highly recommends, even though technically it's not necessary, Facebook asks you to also send the same information from their pixel as well, which means that in your website container, you would have another tag for the same event, and that tag would send data directly to Facebook. So if you have this kind of setup, you will be sending the same conversion twice. One purchase right here and one right here, which will lead to duplicated data. So to avoid that, you should also send event ID, which will help Facebook to deduplicate the event. In this case, the event ID should be sent with the event right here. Then when it is sent to Facebook, it should also be included here. And then that very same ID should be included right here. So if Facebook gets a purchase from here, and both of those purchases have the same event ID, then Facebook will deduplicate and will pick only one of them. So this is very important if you use this kind of a hybrid setup where it is server-side component, but you're also using the native Facebook pixel. Now, this video is already very long, so I don't want to go into too many details. But if you want to learn more about the event ID, how it is used, then I will share a tutorial and I will include it in the description of this video where I show how event ID is used on Shopify and Conversions API setup. And the final mistake is also very related to the event IDs, because you have to make sure that event IDs of both events are the same. And that can be done on the level of website Google Tag Manager container. You need to make sure that the tag which sends data to your server and the Facebook pixel tag, that they fire on the same trigger. Then the event ID will be generated properly and it will be the same across both of these tags. Because if you fire one tag, let's say on DOM ready, which is perfectly normal, and then the other one is fired on a different trigger, they will have different event IDs, which means that you will still have a lot of duplicate data. So make sure that your tags in the web container, and I mean those related tags, they fire on the same trigger. Fixing these mistakes will make sure that your server-side setup foundation is solid. But remember mistake number 6. If your server-side GTM just forwards what the browser gives you, then you are wasting server's potential. You need data enrichment. If you're ready to move beyond a basic server-side setup and you want a step-by-step blueprint for data enrichment, then check out my first-party data masterclass. It is a course designed to connect your online and offline signals without requiring heavy developer resources. I will post a link to it below the video. If you found this video useful, hit the like button. That will help me understand what videos do you like and what should I create in the future. Also, if you want to learn more about Google Tag Manager or Google Analytics, then subscribe to this channel. My name is Julius, this is Analytics Mania, and I'll see you in the next video.